Welcome to the video tutorial on how to load web pics from the Tourney.com website after you have used the Deploy via Web Simple or Deploy via Web Basic web deployment methods. This tutorial will show you how to load those entries into your pool. So if you have not already done so and reviewed the Deploy via Web tutorials, now would be a good time to go back and review the simple and basic method of web deployment, review those tutorials. So we're going to pick up with how to load the web pics from the Tourney.com website, and it's quite easy. We just select the remote menu and then load web pics from Tourney.com, and it's telling us that before we can download our entries we have to establish a password using the control panel. So we'll say OK, and it brings us to the Tourney.com control panel, and we can see here that we're running a pool for the men's basketball tournament, and it has the email address that we use for the Deploy via Web, and that's the address we need to use, or that we're going to use to collect our entries. And before we can collect entries, we need to enter our password into this field. So we'll go ahead and ask it to send us the password. So it's told us now that it's emailed us the password, and we have the password right here in the email message. So we'll go ahead and supply the password. And then we have an option here of auto reset. So every time we download our entries into our pool, do we want to clear out the entries on the Tourney.com website? And this is basically saying it will either always ask us if we want to, or it'll basically either never clear them out or it will always clear them out. I would suggest leaving this as always ask so that you can decide at the time if you want to clear out those entries or not. So once we have this information set, we check the status of our pool, and as you can see, what it's telling me here now is that we have 2 entries that are waiting to be downloaded. So 2 people have entered their pics on the Tourney.com website, and the total available is 998. So for each pool, you basically have the ability to collect up to 1,000 entries. So every time you collect an entry, it counts 1 against your 1,000 entry limit. So typically you would never have to worry about reaching that limit, but in case you do collect a lot of entries, this tells you how many you have left. Now that number may not always match the number of people you have in your pool. So for example, say somebody accidentally submits 4 entries, but you only accept 1 of those entries, you would only have 1 person in your pool, but your total available would only be 996, because even though you only accepted 1, those were 4 entries that were processed. So you can't always assume that the total available will match exactly with how many people are in your pool, so just to be aware of that. And so now we have some options from this screen. It tells us that, again here, it tells us that there's 2 entries waiting to be downloaded, and it tells us the last time that an entry was submitted, which was on this date and time. And from here we have a couple of options. We can either download the entries to our computer and then load them from the file. We can have our entry file emailed to us, or we can clear off the entry file from the Tourney control panel. So these give you kind of some functions that you can use from the control panel, but you probably won't really ever need to use these. They're just mainly there for doing some administration on your site. So we're going to go ahead and close this window, and now we're going to go back to the load web pics since we now have established our password. And we come to the load web pics screen, and it tells us we're loading from Tourney.com, and we just need to select download entries. And because we selected a deadline when we did our Deploy via Web, it's telling us that our entries are going to be checked against that deadline to make sure that no entries were submitted after that time. And we'll say OK. So it's now downloaded the entries, and we basically see here that there's two entries waiting to be downloaded, and we can select Start Import to load the entries. And we come across 1 entry that a person had submitted and actually left a comment for us, and it tells us here, Joe had a comment of, hey there, here's my entry. So any comments that your players attach to the entry page will show up here when you import the entries. Okay, so we've loaded the 2 entries, and if we look at the screen here, it tells us there were 2 players that we downloaded, 2 were processed, 2 of them were good, and there were no errors. So those are all good. And now it's telling us we've imported them, so do we want to reset our entry file? And And what this means is that right now those 2 entries are still stored on the TurboTourney.com website, and if we don't reset them, the next time we load entries from TurboTourney.com, they will still be there. So if you want to say no, you're basically saying, well, I loaded those 2 entries, but I plan on going back and reloading them again at some other point. So maybe you just want to find out, who's all out there, how many people have submitted picks, look at maybe some of their entries. You can see here's their entries now. But the next time you load the picks, you're going to get those same 2 people. So let's go ahead, and if we do this again, we do the remote load web picks from TurboTourney.com. We download, get that same message. As you can see, there's still 2 players in the pool. And now if we import them, we're going to be told, wait a minute, we've already found a player out there with the name of Doug Kolpeck. So we now have to choose, is this a new entry and we want to accept it and basically update the one that we already have, or is it a duplicate and we're just going to skip it? So you have some options here on how you want to handle if a player submits more than 1 entry. How do you want to deal with it? So in this case, let's say that they were, it was a 2nd entry that I submitted. What I can do is I can say, well, let's call this entry Doug Kolpeck 2, and that way I'll know that we're going to store it as a different entry, and we'll tell it to try again. And so it loaded the Doug Kolpeck 2, and now we're being told, well, Joe also has another one out there. And so we'll go ahead and maybe we'll skip on Joe because we know that's a duplicate, and we want to skip it, and that's fine. So then again, we've imported our entries, and so now it's asking us one more time, do you want to reset your entry file? And we'll say no again here. And so now we find out we loaded 1, but 1 was an error, and that was because the one for Joe Smith was skipped. And now if we look at our pool, we actually have 3 players now, and you can see that extra entry is showing up under that number 2 that I entered. So what we can do now is we can delete those entries back to a clean pool, and now let's load the entries one more time. This is normally how you would do it. You'd want to say you want to download the entries, we're going to import them, and we're going to reset the entry file so that we clear off the entries from the server. So these 2 entries are loaded now into my pool, and if I go back to the control panel again and try to download, I'm going to be told there's no more entries because I've removed those 2 from the TurboTourney.com website. So typically what you would want to do is, however often you want to do this, you could do this once a day, twice a day, 100 times a day if you wanted to. You don't have to wait until after the game start. You can load this at any point. Is to download your entries. Once they're loaded and imported into the pool, you'd want to have your entry file reset so that any new entries you get after that point will just be added into the pool later, versus having them continually loading these same picks over and over again. You could also wait until the game start and just do the load web picks from TurboTourney.com one time and get all your entries at one single time. But that's how you would load your picks from TurboTourney.com.